This week's spotlight I want to put on Solomon. I've been thinking about him recently and studying from the book of First Kings about Solomon, and even recently, preached a sermon about it. It's just really been on my mind as I've looked at the example of Solomon. And really what I want to do is, look real quick, kind of a shortened version of Solomon's example. He's actually, on one hand, a really good example, but then on the other hand, he's a really bad example, and we really need to learn from both. And that could be said of everybody, of every example in the Bible, at least, primarily of, most of the good examples, is there are times where, they didn't set such a good example. But for our purposes, in looking at Solomon, Solomon being the son of David, Solomon becoming king after David, but Solomon has a really good example for us in 1 Kings chapter 3. If you look there, I'm not going to read all of this, but if you look in 1 Kings chapter 3, you'll find that, after, David, of course, has died and Solomon has become king, and then the Lord comes to Solomon in a dream, and the Lord comes to him and offers him anything he wants. The Lord tells him, actually in verse 5, "Ask, what shall I give you?" So the Lord comes to Solomon and says, "Whatever you want, ask of me, and I will give it to you." I mean, we could think of money, we could think of long life, we could think of enemies being destroyed, whatever. But Solomon actually does the wisest thing, the best thing, if you will, the right thing, and that is, we find that Solomon goes on to ask of wisdom from God, as he is going to be ruling Israel, the great nation of Israel, God's people. And so Solomon asks the Lord for wisdom, for guidance, for help in understanding good and evil and carrying out justice. And you think, man, that's wonderful. I mean, again, of all the things Solomon could have asked for, money, power, long life, all those things, he didn't. And that's where Solomon is to be greatly commended and held up as a great example. Because we need to be asking of God, not for long life and wealth and, all that stuff, but wisdom and guidance and truth and righteousness and justice. We need to be seeking God's guidance and help, just like Solomon did. And then we can actually go on through, the following chapters and see all the great things that Solomon did and the wisdom he had. But unfortunately now we turn to the unfortunate bad example of Solomon. Even though Solomon was the wisest man, even though at that point in time he did the right thing and he asked God for wisdom and guidance, he became the wisest man that has ever lived. He did a lot of good things. He served the Lord. He built a temple for the Lord. But we find over in 1 Kings chapter 11 that he ended up doing something that the Lord told him not to do, which he told all of Israel not to do. I mean, Solomon knew what God said. I mean, David even encouraged and admonished Solomon before David died to follow the Lord, to be faithful to the Lord, to obey the Lord. The Lord came to Solomon, "Be faithful and obey my word." Solomon knew the word and the law of God. He knew it was pleasing to God. But when it came to God's commandments about not marrying foreign women, lest they, turn your heart away from God after other gods, and Solomon knew that, but unfortunately, that's the one thing that Solomon didn't listen to. The wisest man on earth really became the most foolish man on earth. Because he, for some reason, ignored God's warnings and commandments about marrying foreign women. And chapter 11 says that he, even though the Lord, had commanded not to, he clung to those in love. He loved all of these foreign women, and guess what? They did exactly what God said they would do. They turned his heart away from God. So Solomon spent his time, the rest of his life, as far as we know. I mean, if you take the account in Kings, Solomon became displeasing to the Lord, unfaithful to the Lord. He was worshiping other gods. The Lord was angry, and that's when the Lord promised to take away the kingdom. We know Jeroboam would rebel, then it leads to the division of the kingdom between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. But Solomon just, for some reason, could not let go of his love and lust for foreign women, for those who are not of God's people. And he allowed his heart to turn from the Lord, and in the end of his life was not pleasing to God. And it all went downhill from there. We've got to be careful, though. What we learned from Solomon, what I learned from Solomon, is while we today, we have the Word of God, we know the Word of God, we know what He calls us to do, how He calls us to live, we know what God tells us is sin, He tells us to stay away from sin. And we may be doing a lot of good things, and hopefully we're doing all good things, but is there, like Solomon, is there something in our life that we're clinging to, that we're not letting go of? Is there something that even though we know the Word of God and His warnings and His wrath against sin, there's something in our flesh and our lusts that we're just not willing to let go? We're not willing to give up. And if that's the case, if we're not willing to give up all sin and all things for the Lord, then we're going to wind up being displeasing to the Lord just like Solomon. So let's make sure, number one, let's follow Solomon's good example. And let's ask of wisdom from God, seek His wisdom and His word, His knowledge, His commandments, His grace, His mercy, His guidance, His help. And number two, let's examine our hearts, examine our lives, and make sure, really be honest and make sure that there's not something we know better. We know what God says, but we got to make sure we're not clinging to things that we know we shouldn't be. So let's learn from Solomon, lest we end up like Solomon, lest we be punished like Solomon. And let's make sure that we're faithful to God with all of our heart and all of our lives. God bless.